Hi guys, it's Owen here from D20. My video from last week, my rant video about men wearing shorts, generated a fair amount of hate on YouTube and Facebook and a couple other places, and that was surprising. I was quite surprised by the degree of hate that it pulled in. I mean, I realized it was an unpopular opinion, but I didn't realize just how seriously guys take their shorts. So firstly, I want to say, soz rocket guys, I didn't mean it personally. I was just exploring a general principle. But something interesting came out of it, out of the feedback that I received, which relates to this thing that I said. If you work in a certain kind of office, you wear a suit and tie when you go to the office because you want people to think a certain way of you. You want them to think of you as professional. You wouldn't wear your shorts, t-shirt and slops to the office because you would come across as unprofessional and people wouldn't take you as seriously. So I think everybody's getting by default that this is a thing that happens, but it might be uncomfortable to think about the kinds of inferences that people would draw from the choices that you make, especially if they're choices that you like to make. If you like to wear shorts, you might not want to think about the fact that other people might not think that favorably of you for doing so. So what I assumed in my my analysis was that it's kind of obvious to everybody that that signaling through your clothing is a thing, and that it's appropriate to dress in a certain way in certain situations because of the way that what you're dressing is communicating to people. I mean, I know I explained it a little bit at the beginning of the video, but that explanation was really just for context and not really because I thought that people needed to have this stuff explained to them. Apparently, I was wrong in that assessment. It seems that a lot of guys simply aren't aware that your clothing represents a form of communication, or they're in denial of it. So I want to just go through a sort of a brief primer on where this idea comes from, that it's really not that crazy. Okay, so it comes from social psychology, and specifically an element of it called signaling theory. So for those of you who aren't accustomed to dealing with science, the word theory means something quite different in scientific circles than what it means in conventional usage. So when you use the word theory in conventional usage, you just mean it's an idea. You have a theory about how something works. It's just an idea. It's maybe a hypothesis. In scientific terms, the word theory means something quite different. A theory is a really complicated model which includes all kinds of facts, lines of evidence, explanatory ideas, hypotheses, or all of the kind of the cloud of ideas and facts and notions about a topic are all sort of clustered together in a theory. And in order to be considered a theory, that cloud of ideas, that cloud of facts and evidence and hypotheses needs to be pretty well supported. It needs to be quite far along in its development. I mean, you start with an idea and then it becomes a hypothesis, and then you cluster more hypotheses together, and then lines of evidence, and over time eventually that might graduate to what you might call a theory. I mean, there are plenty of theories in science, but some of the ones you might have heard of are things like the theory of evolution. Now, it's a common misconception that Charles Darwin came up with the theory of evolution. He didn't. The theory of evolution predated Darwin by some time. I mean, it was grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, he was working on the theory of evolution long before Charles Darwin was born. Well, all Charles Darwin did was he contributed the theory of natural selection to the theory of evolution. So he took this thing that was already fairly well understood, this notion that evolution had happened. There was lots of evidence. It wasn't even all that controversial that evolution had occurred. And Darwin introduced the idea of natural selection as the mechanism for how evolution happens. There were other controversial ideas that have fed into it over the centuries, really. But that, you get the idea. A theory is a much larger model of how something in the world works than just one idea, natural selection versus the whole of evolution. So in social psychology, when we talk about signaling theory, we're not just talking about a random notion that somebody's had that, signaling might be a thing. This is a really well-supported body of evidence and theory and ideas and explanatory reasoning and all kinds of stuff all melded together into this really well thing that isn't, as a whole, it's not controversial. Elements of it might be controversial, hotly contested. We might not all agree that this thing versus that thing, but as a whole, signaling theory is not controversial. It's pretty much accepted by all social social scientists. Now, let me also get this out of the way. Social science is what we call a soft science, as opposed to hard sciences. Hard sciences are things like physics, chemistry, astronomy, things where you can get exact measurements and exact readings and make precise predictions about the future of how these things might work within those models. Social sciences or social psychology, which includes various other social sciences. These are what we call soft sciences, because they're dealing with with systems that are so complex, specifically the way that people behave and interact, and animals behave and interact, the human mind and how all of that stuff works. These systems are so complicated that it's really, really difficult to derive highly specific theories and ideas about how these things operate and to make precise predictions. You're dealing with lower levels of probability here. So you can make a social scientific prediction about certain kinds of human behavior that have a fairly reliable success rate, but you're never going to approach the kind of precision that you get in the hard sciences, simply because of the sheer complexity of the systems that you're dealing with. So social psychology, signaling theory, it's the theory that describes how different organisms communicate with each other. Simply, that's what signaling theory is. Now, when I talk about organisms, it's not just humans. Anything from bacteria, plants, all kinds of animals, we're all able to communicate from one to another. And different species, different kinds of organisms use different forms of communication. I mean, if you're a bacterium, pretty much you're limited to chemical communication. That's all you've got. Most plants also are limited to chemical communication. Animals have a few more options. Some are able to communicate through a combination of chemical, auditory, and various other signals. Some are able to use visual signals. As humans, we probably have the most sophisticated system of communication in all of nature, out of the entire animal, well, not just animal kingdom, but out of all living organisms. We appear to have the most complicated and sophisticated form of communication. Not only do we have language, which appears to be unique to humans. I know some people like to think about certain other species like dolphins and chimpanzees as using something like language, and it is something like language as far as we can tell, but it seems to be a more rudimentary form. When we talk about language, you're talking about having a lexicon of words. Each word represents an idea, and when you combine those words in a specific sequence, and it has to be a specific sequence, it can't just be chopped and changed around, those words will take on a whole new meaning and are able to describe abstract ideas and can describe things that aren't necessarily immediately present in front of the person that's having it described to them. Other species, their forms of communication seem to be less sophisticated, in that although they have a lexicon of words that each mean a thing, something like grammar and context and syntax don't seem to apply to these other species' forms of communications. Now, some of the more complicated, the more intelligent animal species that we've been able to interact with can be taught to use human language in a very rudimentary, limited way, but just because they're capable of grasping the basic fundamentals of how language works doesn't mean that it's something that they necessarily use. So language, it seems to be something that's unique to humans, and that's what we call verbal communications. That's when what I'm using with you guys right now is verbal communication. I'm talking to you, I'm using this word, using these words, this language, this form of communication that appears to be unique to humans. But it's not the only tool in our box. We have other things we can do. For example, there are non-verbal vocal communications. So when I say which you might notice I say a lot, is not a word. It's not a sentence. It doesn't have any inherent meaning. But when I use the sound when I generate that utterance, it is actually conveying meaning to you. It says something like, I'm busy thinking about the next thing that I'm going to say. I'm not done talking yet, so please hold on, don't interrupt me. I'm going to get to it in a second. That's quite a lot of meaning packed into just a small little utterance like See, there it is again. Now that I'm talking about it, now I'm aware that I'm doing it. And I know I do it a lot more than most people, so now I'm kind of obsessing over it. So that's going to happen. Various other forms of non-verbal vocal communication as well. For example, just using the words of a sentence conveys some of the meaning, but the way that you communicate those words implies further meaning. So, for example, if you communicate something at a high volume or a high pitch or a low pitch, it can change the contextual connotation of the words that you're using. It actually changes the meaning of what you're saying based on how you're presenting it. Some languages, some human languages, incorporate that element, sort of a tonal element into the formalized version of the language. Others, like most Indo-European languages, of which English is one, don't formalize that kind of thing. It's just sort of implied based on the context. But we all kind of read it. We're used to reading that kind of non-verbal cue. It's non-verbal because it's not the words that you're using, but it is a vocal utterance. So it's non-verbal vocal utterance, non-verbal vocal communication. But we also have non-vocal communication systems like gestures, for example. I wave my hands around quite a lot when I'm explaining ideas. For me, it's a way of I'm making the shape of the ideas in my mind with my hands, and I'm trying to communicate that with you so that you can have a similar shape of the ideas in your brain, if that makes any sense. I don't know. That's what I'm doing when I'm waving my hands around while I'm talking. But it's a thing that a lot of people do. Some people do it more than others. I tend to do it a fair amount, but that's, it's still a form of communication. I'm still trying to impart information to you using the gestures that I'm having. Obviously, sign language is a more formalized version of that, and sign language sort of crosses the line between gestural nonverbal cues and verbal communication, because it's still a formal verbal language. Like there's a lexicon and there's all that kind of stuff. You're just not using spoken words. You're using gestures that represent things. It's an interesting phenomenon, and like I said, this is messy and complex. But we're not talking about sign language today. The thing that brings us back to the previous video is that the objects and the symbols and the colors that you choose to adorn yourself with are also a form of communication. Now, this is how I started the previous video, was that when you're getting dressed in the morning, you're making certain choices about the information that you choose to convey about yourself to the people around you. And this is not controversial. This is really well understood throughout all of social sciences. Signaling through nonverbal cues, through adornment, it's a given. I mean, it's so obvious to people that it doesn't even really need explanation. I mean, you pick up any social science university textbook, you'll get maybe a paragraph on it because they don't have to explain it. It's intuitively obvious to everyone, or at least that's the assumption, and that's what I assumed. But apparently, it wasn't that obvious. All right, so. I hope that I've given you a bit of an understanding of the background of where it comes from. If you want to take a look at the wealth of literature on the subject, just do a Google Scholar search on social science signaling theory. There's so much of it. I'll post a couple of links below of some of the studies that relate to the kind of stuff that we're talking about here, but I'm really not going to bore you by going through all the literature. That's not what this format is for. YouTube videos are for doing something else. And what that thing is, I want to describe a scenario of two guys that I actually know. I'm not going to use their real names. I'm going to call them Carl and Henry. Now, I want to use this as an example to illustrate the significance of being aware and of how you present yourself to the world, but not only through your clothing, but partially through your clothing, through the way that you choose to adorn yourself, through these nonverbal cues. Now, Carl and Henry have a lot in common. They're about the same age. They studied, if not at the same university, then at similar universities doing the same kind of degree, computer science. They both, out of varsity, went into software engineering and software development. Like I said, very similar skill set. They have a similar background. They're both white male South Africans with a middle class upbringing. Personality-wise, they're fairly similar. They're both nice, approachable guys. They have strong relationships with their family. They have lovely wives, beautiful children. They get along well with their co-workers. The one fundamental difference between the two is that Carl has this attitude that he should be able to behave and dress and talk to people however he likes, and people should not judge him for any of that. His work should speak for itself, and the rest of it is just, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Henry, on the other hand, it's his understanding that although technical skills are important, and he is technically proficient and technically good at what he does, he also thinks that it's important to present himself in a way that is professional, that is neat and tidy and clean and fitting to the context, and presents a good example of himself to the people around him. That includes dressing well, that includes speaking in a professional way, being diplomatic in your interactions with other people. Carl doesn't see those things as important. Henry does. So now these two guys, fresh out of varsity at age 25, they enter the same industry. They, like I said, they're software programmers. They're both programming in a particular service industry. 20 odd years later, they find themselves working for the same company, which is a really large corporate, one of the largest companies in this country. They're working in the same department. They work together. They know each other. Because they're both nice guys. They get along. But the thing that's different about them now, 20 years later, is that while Carl is the head developer, he commands a decent salary. His work does speak for itself. He's really, really good at what he does. He has a small team of junior developers who help him with the grunt work of the stuff that he doesn't feel like doing. He gets to choose the projects that he wants to work on within this organization. He's very well thought of within the technical sphere of what he does. That's Carl. He earns a good salary. It's good to be Carl. He has, like I said, a comfortable home life. He works hard. He works long hours, but he also takes care of himself and he takes care of his family. Carl's life is cool. It's nice. It's really great. He earns more money than I've ever earned, even back when I was in IT, but that's because I sucked at IT. I was terrible at it. Carl's actually really good at it. His skills are sought after. He gets to, like I said, command a big salary. He gets to work pretty much for whatever company he wants to work for, whichever one treats him the best. Life is good for Carl. Henry, on the other hand, after graduating from university with a degree in software engineering in computer science, 20 years later, he spent the first few years of his life developing, in which he was good at it, and so he got himself a couple of good jobs. But then this other element, this side of his personality and this attitude that he has that is positive towards signaling, to dressing in a professional way, behaving in a professional way, speaking to people a certain way, that afforded him certain opportunities. Within a couple of years, he was team leader within his development crew. A couple of years after that, he was a junior manager. Now, 20 years later, he's a senior manager within this corporation. He's in charge of the department that Carl works in. He's Carl's boss's boss. Although they're roughly the same age, they have a similar background, they have a lot in common, technical skills, all that kind of stuff. This extra skill has allowed Henry's career trajectory to move even further than Carl's, because Carl's career trajectory looks like this, Henry's looks like that. Henry is known on a first name basis by the senior management of the corporation that he works in, like the CEO, who is a person who is in the news on a weekly basis in South Africa. This CEO knows Henry by name, has meetings with him on a weekly basis as well. That CEO has never heard Carl's name, doesn't know who he is, wouldn't recognize him on the street. Henry has developed this reputation within the organization and within the industry as somebody who can be trusted, who can be relied upon, who can be taken in front of customers, who can be in high-level meetings, whereas Carl can't do any of those things. As a result, Henry earns a salary 2 to 3 times that of what Carl does. So that's not to say that Carl has a bad life. Far from it. Carl does great. Henry does better, because he has this attitude about the signaling that he portrays, that it's not that he is a slave to other people's perceptions, but that he recognizes that other people's perceptions of him are something that, firstly, that he has some control over by deciding what he's going to wear and how he's going to behave around people. He can affect the perceptions of people around him, and also that there's benefit to him, to his career, to his advancement, to his bottom line in fostering positive perceptions of other people towards him. So this is why Henry is doing better than Carl. Now, I know a lot of guys who are like Carl, and I know lots of guys who are like Henry, and a few guys who are sort of in between the two. Being Henry arguably is better than being Carl, but some of the guys who are like Carl for a reason. They choose to be like Carl because to them it's worth it to be able to wear shorts to work. They're perfectly happy to take that overall lower salary for the eventuality of their career for the right to be able to wear shorts to work in the short term. And that's cool, you know? If you're happy to be Carl, I would probably be happy to be Carl. That's fine. All I'm asking is that we all are cognizant of the fact that by choosing to wear shorts to work or something like that, I'm now using shorts to work as a shorthand for that kind of behavior, that kind of attitude. By choosing to wear shorts to work, you're limiting your earning potential and your career opportunities. And not just that, but you're also limiting your mating opportunities, because frankly, if you're a man and if you're a straight man, you're trying to attract the attention of women for sexual opportunities. Women like it when you make an effort for them. I mean, not all women like the same things. Some women might find shorts attractive in particular, but that's a particular detail that doesn't apply to everyone. And what women want is for you to make an outward appearance of having made an effort to present yourself in the best possible light. Because I mean, men like that too, right? Men like women who've dressed up. Why wouldn't women like that as well? So what I'm suggesting is that Carl has, through this attitude that he has, he's limited his opportunities both professionally, possibly sexually, and he's put a cap on how far he can advance. In fact, within the organization that he works in, he literally can't earn any more money. He's at the absolute ceiling for his level. If he wants to earn more money, he has to advance into management. Or has to move to another company that's prepared to pay him more. But frankly, there aren't any other companies that are prepared to pay him more, because within the market, within the industry that he works in, he's already working for the best company, the company that is prepared to pay him the most. He can't get another raise, another significant raise, without switching into management. But because of this attitude that he has, he can't make that transition from technical to management. He's limited his earning opportunities, and there's nothing really he can do about it without shifting his attitudes. And like I said, maybe that's fine. Maybe Carl's comfortable with that. Maybe he's happy to keep living at that level for the next 20 years. You know, I probably would be. Like I said, he does well for himself. But Carl never gets to be Henry, and that kind of sucks for Carl. Alright, so I hope I've made my position a little clearer. I do have some more thoughts on this subject, and I might make another follow-up video in the future. I'm going to put on my helmet. It's back there, it's in that box, and I'm going to prepare for the inevitable flood of hate that's going to come about this. Remember, guys, I'm not talking about you personally. I'm talking about Henry and Carl personally, but Henry and Carl hopefully don't know that I'm talking about them. I'm just using those as examples for general trends. If you happen to like shorts, cool, right? Just be aware that wearing shorts to work might have long-term consequences for you. That's all I ask. All right, I think I've repeated myself enough in this video, so I'm going to call it. As always, if you have something more to say, comments below, like, comment, subscribe, all of that stuff helps. It improves my reach, and it helps me drive more people to my patreon.com/D20, which will allow me to hopefully produce more of this kind of content in future. All right, that's it for now. SWAT out.